Good afternoon. Today I'd like to take you through some basic charting in Bokeh. This is a parallel of what we did in Altair, but we do this because these are two separate libraries with separate strengths and weaknesses, and it's nice to sort of follow the same exercises in both to try and understand where you should use the one and where you should use the other. Right. So you can follow along with this exercise by looking on the lecture notes. You'll see there that the only prerequisite for this is that you have a working mini conda 3 and that you can create new environments. And then we'll just do the usual dance where you go and clone the GitHub repo that I'll put up, and then you will go and create or update your environment called Bokeh or VXUni Bokeh. You'll activate that, and we deviate in this case because Bokeh to work correctly in JupyterLab and in this case JupyterLab, it has many other applications. We need to install this special lab extension. You'll see more of these as we go along. So in Jupyter, by doing this, it will then go and use the node.js that I've also added to the dependencies, and it will build a whole new front end for itself to install that plugin. And this will give us an interactive Bokeh in the JupyterLab notebooks. Okay, so when that's active, you go to the directory that you've checked out, the Bokeh basic charting, and you start JupyterLab. Easy as that. Okay, so remember that with Altair basic charting, our goal was to create a candlestick chart. Here's one example of such a chart. It's slightly less depressing than it was yesterday and the day before. But what you see here is that each candlestick, just to quickly summarize, is either red or green, depending on whether the closing price for that period was greater or smaller than the opening price. So that's telling you if it's going up or down. And then the line over here is showing you the extent between the lowest price and the highest price. Okay, so it's almost like an error bar in stats, but just a bit different and sometimes more depressing. Okay, so in Bokeh, the general procedure is that we create a figure object. This is almost always the case. And we then take that figure object and then we set properties on it to set the size and all kinds of chart metadata. And then we also call methods on that object to create glyphs. So glyphs refer to marks, graphical marks that live in the space of that plot and that usually are used to encode aspects of your data. Okay, so as is always the case, I have a separate Python file that contains a number of functions which I will invoke from the Jupyter Notebook, but we'll go through these step by step just so it's all clear what's going on. So I chose in this case to make a simple function called make candlesticks, and this takes as input a data frame. And if you remember from the previous case, I'm going to skip through that because that's also discussed in the Altair intro or the Altair basic charting. I have some code which uses pandas, and then it scrapes, it's not really scrape, it actually interprets the table from this web page on CoinMarketCap, and then it gets us a beautiful data frame full of recent daily data. So we can see this up to the 12th, September 12th. And then, as is always also the case in the Altair basic charting, I rename some of these columns to get rid of these asterisks that I can also use attribute access to look at them. Right, so let's just quickly run this code and see what this first function or what it's going to get us. Right, so this is the function that we're going to look at in more detail right now. That's at make candlesticks. So I gave it the eth price, and the eth price was a data frame with these columns and then these values. This is the first few rows. And then this will generate for me a figure, that figure object. And then because I've already told Bokeh that I want it to output into the notebook, when I call show on that figure object, I get this nice chart over here. And the excellent thing is that it's already interactive. So I've got zooming, I've got panning, I've even got this sort of ROI zooming, and I can return and I can save the chart, and I've also activated tooltips. So it's not showing me my opening, closing, high, low prices. I'll get to that in a minute or five. Let's see. But it's at least showing me intrinsic values that's available to it. It's like the X and the Y in the data, and the X and the Y in screen coordinates, and the index of that row in the table. Okay, so let's see how that happened, or what the API was like. So I called that make candlesticks function. I gave it that data frame, and it gave me back that figure. So just to see what happens in that code. So this is a typical pandas data frame pattern, is that I take that whole table, and by writing this boolean price.close, which is a whole column in the table larger than price.open, I get a new column which is true when close is greater than open, and false when close is not greater than open. And the same for text. So this is increasing and decreasing. And with this vectorized thinking in pandas and this sort of tool, you'll see I can use this mask in a minute to just plot the red and the green bars. Right. So here is let's say the central instantiation of that figure object. In this case, I tell it that in that pandas data frame, my x-axis type is a date time, so it has special handling for those date time fields. And you'll recall from the Altair basic charting lesson, you'll recall that I gave the read_html, I asked it to please parse the dates from the first column. So it's already converted these into pretty date times. And now in Bokeh, I just tell it that's a date time, so it knows about that. I tell it which tools I want. So that tools is a constant in the source code up here. So this is a list of strings telling it I want pan, wheel, zoom, box zoom, hover, reset, and save. Okay, and then the plot width, these are just standard kind of plot figure metadata items, what the title should be, and the height. And in this specific case, I'm giving it an explicit Y range. This is normally not necessary. It will figure it out by itself. But in this case, because I might want to add my volume chart to this chart later, I do specify my Y range. I give it a minimum which is lower than the Ethereum ETH price for this time range. I could have just used the min over here, and then I tell it I want just like 10% more than the maximum in that data. Okay, so that's the figure, and then here I just show that this is how, after you've created the figure, Bokeh convention, you call it P. I can in this case just change the grid lines and give them a bit of an alpha, and this just makes them, as you can see here, not as definite or as thick. Right, and then I call methods on that figure object. In this case, the segment, that's the line segment. So I draw line segments. I have two coordinates, x, y, x, y. So I draw them from date high to date low. So that will give me a vertical line. And in this case, I give them the color black. Although, well, I could just as well have given them the same color as the bar. And then, similarly to the Altair basic charting, I create two sets of bar glyphs, vertical bars. So in one case, here is that mask I told you about. So remember that ink is a column with trues and falses. So I'm telling this v bar I only want to plot at the x coordinates where this ink is true. In other words, only where I should have green. In other words, closing price higher than opening price. Okay, and this is the width, and that's also just the constant that I've defined before the time it's in the source code. And then I give it the full color, and it's just the let's say the outline color, and I do the same for the red. And once I've done all of that, let's just make sure that that's the whole thing. Yeah, there's the mask, and there I declare the figure and the grid alpha, and then I give it the 3. Then I install these 3 sets of glyphs. I install that figure, and we'll get in a minute we'll get to how Bokeh treats this internally, and then I return that whole figure. And the nice thing is I can then in my where is that now? In my invocation over here, I can just return that P over here. P equals, there we go, make candlesticks, and then I show it, and then I get this chart. Okay, but you'll also remember from the Altair basic charts and from this candlesticks over here, the candlestick charts over here, I have not only my candlesticks, but at the bottom here I also have the trading volume for that period of time. So this could be days or hours or 4 hours in my case, or in this specific case, we have data that's per day. Right, so, but, wait, just before we get there, this is an alternative formulation which is quite important for me to mention. And that is, so you will have seen here that I use this pattern where I make these pandas data frame conditionals. And I do it in a vectorized way. So I say, is this column larger than that column, and that gives me a whole column of trues and false, which is really convenient. But in Bokeh, what's actually happening under the cover is that it's converting everything to a Bokeh native data structure called the column data source. And the reason why Bokeh is not just using pandas as their native data format, they could have, is that they didn't want to create that extra dependency. So they wanted to keep this internal. And it turns out in practice that if I want to use some of the more advanced bokeh features like linked selection, and in my specific case, I only want to show a tooltip with the opening and closing prices, I do have to resort to a column data source. So this is different from what we just saw. So instead, where we just had, I just gave it directly the column from the pandas data frame. In the case of a column data source, that looks different, because then I construct the column data source. Fortunately, that's quite easy. I just give it the data frame and wrap it in a column data source. Then I have that. But now my invocation of the glyph creation is different. So instead of giving it the pandas column over here, I give it a name, and then I specify the source column data source. And internally, Bokeh will know that it needs to find the date column inside of that source. Okay. So the reason why I'm doing it over here is I would like tooltips. So once again, let's just see what we're working towards. So here I'm invoking a different function called make candlesticks CS for column data source. Let's just see what that looks like. And you'll see the difference over here is it's more or less the same plot. It should be the same plot. There we go. Let's just reset that. But where up here I'm only seeing plot intrinsic values, down here I've specified that I want to see the opening and the closing price. And you can see in that tooltip I very nicely see the opening price in this specific case of $286 and the closing price of $232. So it lost a lot of value on that day, and that's why this bar is red. Okay, in order to do that, I have no other choice but to use the column data source. And what I then can do is I specify these tooltips, and then when and this tooltip is telling me in this little box over here with what it should do with, what it should display. And then on the left in blue you have the name of the value, and on the right the key of the value. On the right you have the value. Okay, so and over here I said at open and at close, and that means go look in the column data source to find that value at that point, and that's how the tooltips work. Okay, so now there's a little extra complication, because now the question arises. Okay, but I was using, so I have tooltips now, which is great. But now the question arises, how do I do the filtering? Because I still want my red and my green bars, but I cannot, unfortunately, I can't mix data frame access like I did in the first example with a column data source access. I have to pick one or the other, right? So because I need the tooltips, I need the column data source, and because I need the column data source, I can only specify these names for the columns. So I can't give it that nice mask to tell it to render only on the red or on the green. And now I have to use Bokeh syntax to do this. So what we use in this case, we use a view. So this is almost analogous to a database view. So we have the source with the full data, and the view is a filtered version of that. And so I do that, I create the CDS view. This is all in the code that you will find on the GitHub. There's a CS. And what happens here is I create this view, and I give it the source, and I give it a number of filters. And in this case, I only have one filter. It's a Boolean filter where price close is bigger than price open. So that's a green bar, and then I render that bar given that view. So now it will only render at the dates where this Boolean was true. And the same goes for the red bar glyphs. So it's a little bit of extra code that I have to write. And I would personally have, I've liked to be able to use this, the pandas way of, this vectorized indexing, or this slice-based indexing, where I just give it the whole column, and out pops only the ones that I want. So it's sort of a mask. But okay, this is the way it works, and I get a lot for that in return. Okay, so that was a brief detour, and this is actually not. It's a good place to quickly talk about what happens, or how Bokeh works behind the scenes. So it's very similar to Altair in the sense that all of this Python code, on the Bokeh side in your notebook, that results in a full JSON representation of that whole figure object and all of the marks in it, and that's then sent to the front end to bokeh.js for interactive rendering. So I think this is quite interesting to take note of. I explained it now in terms of JSON, but what's the case if we talk about it in more abstract terms, is that every visualization, every chart in Bokeh is a scene graph. So a scene graph is a hierarchy of objects which appear in a scene, and they have this document abstraction which acts as a container for the plot, for that figure that we created, and all of the other elements in there. This is an example from the Bokeh reference, right? And that document is that's the unit of serialization, and that's the unit that's also sent to the front end. But it helps a lot if you think about this when you create these charts. Okay, so something that we were not able to do in Altair, but which is a lot easier in Bokeh, is adding the volume plot directly to the existing candlesticks. So we wrote another function for this. So let's just go to the actual function, and we called it add volume bars. And what's nice is that this we could write this to take the same data frame as input, and then a figure that already contains some glyphs. And so that logically the idea here is that you first create the candlesticks chart or figure, pass that in, and this add volume bars will then instrument that with the necessary glyphs. So another aspect of Bokeh is that you can have these extra Y ranges, any number, which is nice. That means you can have multiple have multiple glyphs looking at multiple different Y ranges in the same chart. And this is exactly what we need now. So we have the volume chart, which lives in the range of billions of dollars, and we have the candlestick charts, which live in the domain of $150 to $200. And so it's nice to be able to represent that. So over here we say, well, we want an extra Y range, and we will key this by vol for volume. And then we have a range which starts at the minimum volume, and it goes up to the maximum volume times 3. The reason why I do that is because I want the volume to sort of be constrained to the bottom third of the chart. And then we just draw the V-bars with exactly the same invocation as we had for the pandas version. So we give it the date, and we give it the top of each bar is the actual volume, all columnar, all vectorized thinking, and we have to tell it to use this additional Y range, which we named over there. So we just give it the same name. And then we just, because we would like to see this, we add an additional axis on the right-hand side that also visualizes this volume. And this is quite nice here. I use a numeral tick formatter to be able to show those billions of dollars in a more or less readable format. And this is just saying that it should be on the right-hand side. So let's just see what that looks like. So here's the lab. So let's have a look over here. So I call the candlesticks over here, and that gives me a figure. And you'll note that I create a separate figure. Bokeh does not like it very much if you reuse these figure objects to display multiple things. You can try, and it usually works, but yeah, sometimes you get weird effects when because you modify the figure object in place. Okay, so and then I call this add volume bars function I just wrote. So look, I give it the same data frame, and I give it this figure object as input, and I get a new figure output, and then I can display that. So what happens over here? This was not, well, with Altair it may be possible, but at least I have not figured that out yet, because Altair auto scales on the Y. But because we were able now to specify this extra Y range and also sort of constrain it to the bottom third of the plot, I get this very nice volume and candlestick plot with, on the right hand side, very neatly you can see the volume on this day was just under $2 billion or US billion dollars, and on the left hand side it's maintained by the Ethereum prices. So that worked really well. Okay, so finally, just because we did that in Altair basic charting, it's just fair that although we did something extra in Bokeh, we should also replicate what we did in Altair. And that means we have to link these plots. And you'll remember that in Altair, that was quite a journey figuring out how to do that. We had to dig into the Vega documentation to figure out what needed to be done in Vega, and then sort of reverse engineer to find out what to do in Altair from the Python side to get that Vega specification out. Things are a lot easier in Bokeh. It's actually pretty intuitive. So I take when I want to make, I just first encapsulated that in a separate call called make volume bars, and this is just following the same pattern. So I create the figure, I set the properties, I give it, in this case, also its own numeral tick formatter. This is working slightly differently because this is the primary Y range. All of this will be on the GitHub and also in the lecture notes. and then I create the bars. So that's pretty simple, right? So now I have a separate volume figure, and then comes the magic. So I've written another function called make linked candlesticks and volume. And here you can see what happens. So it uses the make candlesticks function to create that, and it uses the make volume bars function to create that. So these are two figures. And then I very simply go and say, well, the second figure's X range property should equal the first figure's X range property. And now they're linked. And let's just see what that looks like. Also very important, this grid plot is a layout. So I can give it rows of figures like this. And in this case, that's one row. I could have had more figures in there, but I have only one in that row, and then I have one in this row, and that means it will align, it will make them vertically adjacent. So let's just see what that looks like. There we go. So there we have it. We have a linked x-axis, and that was pretty easy. So I can also zoom in and out here. And the interesting thing is that unlike the Altair basic charting version, this linkage is bidirectional, which is also quite cool. Okay, so that works. So one conclusion we can come to over here is that at least the linking is a lot more intuitive, and it also does a bit more. Okay, so I have some notes in here. Just to conclude this this lecture. I think Bokeh is really it's really quite flexible. Bokeh is really quite flexible. It feels more flexible than Altair, but this is something that one will have to sort of explore over time. That flexibility comes at a price. You have to do a bit more reading. And in addition to that, Bokeh uses function wrappers quite often, and it also uses args and keyword args explicitly quite often instead of specifying all these keywords. That ensures, or that helps the Bokeh authors to keep their code generic and to generate the different plot types in a systematic fashion. But the only problem is that even in an IDE like PyCharm, getting help on the on the different functions. This one is actually not too bad, but you will note that as you drill down into the various constructs, it's not easy finding help or finding finding well formatted help. Let's just have a look. See there, I'm going down to segment, and you can see segment is actually constructed by a function, which is then called, at least they explicitly put the documentation in here. But this strategy, although it makes for a very generic mechanism, is not always ideal for IDEs. So that being said, the documentation is quite good. You just have to keep that at hand. I've added some notes to the lecture notes, explaining how you can add the external documentation URL pattern to your PyCharm, so that when you press Shift F1, it will take you to the correct place. This only works for a subset of Bokeh. This is not configured. Sorry, you will have to follow the show notes. Okay, so that's it for at least the Bokeh basic charting. We'll be back with both Altair and Bokeh with more advanced charting techniques and more interaction and more link brushing and so forth. But I hope this has given you a good sampling of what it's like to work with Bokeh. To summarize up to now, when Altair has what you need, that's clearly a very, very good option. But if you need more flexibility, or you think that you'll be able, you'll want to manipulate very specific aspects of your visualizations, then Bokeh could be a very good choice. Thank you very much for listening. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.